Hello, everybody. I'm here with Professor Pieranna Garavaso. She is a emeritus faculty at the University of Minnesota Morris. We are here to talk about analytical philosophy, maybe philosophy in general, and feminism and analytical feminism. Professor, in your book, the Bloomsbury for Analytical Feminism, you gave the definition of from Tim Crane that there's two necessary requirements for analytical philosophy. One is there are these canonical texts which you don't agree with or don't like, and then there's questions in relation to these texts and how a text is read, right? But that does sound a little vague. So how would you describe yourself as an analytical philosopher, and what do you do? And more distinctly, how are you not a scientist, a mathematician, or an artist, or a debater?
Yeah, very good question. Okay, so first of all, like Tim Crane article, Understanding the History of Philosophy, because he tries to identify, explain what the philosophical tradition is. And he has three conditions. The first one, there has to be a group of texts that are considered to be canonical. Now, I don't agree, Seb, because everybody doesn't like to set on just a unique group of readings. Some people want to include Plato, some people don't, some people want to include Simone de Beauvoir, some people don't. So it's very debatable. So instead of saying that there is a fixed set of reading, I think it's more fluid. It's kind
Yeah,
of like a family resemblance, a group of texts that are connected. What mattered to me was that he points out that we read text differently in different traditions. So when I left Italy, where I studied only continental philosophy, and came to the United States, where I did mostly analytic philosophy. And by the way, at the beginning, they used to call this philosophy analytical, but now it's much more common to call it analytic. It may seem a little different, but I just wanted to tell you it's analytic
yeah. Oh,
philosophy.
okay, sure, sure.
And so when I came here, I discovered that Plato was read in a totally different way
Yeah,
from the way I was reading it in Italy. So that was an example that confirmed me that Crane was right
yeah,
when he talked about reading within a tradition. And then to clarify that, he says that the questions that people come are different. So, because within a certain tradition, different questions come up as important. Now, you attach to that a very big question whether philosophy is art or is mathematics. I think analytic philosophy is both an art and owes a lot to logic, which is related to mathematics, but not really. Logic is connected with reasoning. And so I think analytic philosophy stresses reasoning, argumentation, much less association or poetry, literature. They are beautiful and important, but when you're doing analytic philosophy, you're really concerned about the structure of your arguments, of your reasoning, the meaning of terms, and it's an art in some ways because it's a practice. It's not just reading, it's thinking and practicing the
yeah.
argumentation. And so, in that sense, I think it is similar to art. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I guess I just noticed that it is like art because, I mean, if I were to explain it, you want to give an argument, but you can argue about pretty much anything, kind of. So, like
Yes.
it's pretty vast technically. because you can put anything into an argument and talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and also reasons like mathematics. But what about like the debating or persuasiveness aspect of philosophy, of analytical philosophy? Because it's kind of like analytical philosophy is kind of like a battleground where ideas come to either die or survive. And then I say this is necessary, or this is a necessary or sufficient condition. And then we just go back and forth. And then, no, that's not right. Or there's this element to it where it's kind of combative. What do you think? In a sense, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be. There is much of a controversy about whether philosophy, and in particular analytic philosophy, is combative, as you say. There is a very cute TED talk, I think his name is Cohen, in which he argues that philosophy loses if we make it combative, because it
Oh, okay.
shouldn't be. It should. I mean, if you argue with me and you show
Oh, I
me
see.
that
Yeah,
my
yeah,
argument is not good, that's better for me than
yeah.
continuing to
Okay.
believe a falsehood. And so, Ted Cohen, I don't know if it is Ted, but Cohen, in that TED talk, argues that it shouldn't be taken as combative,
Yeah,
that we should be thankful when people discuss with us. And so I do like that aspect of analytic philosophy, as you pointed out before, where in a sense everything is open, any opinion. But the issue is whether you can plausibly support it. So you talk about persuasion. You see, the big dispute between Socrates and the sophists was exactly about that. The sophists were trying just to persuade. It didn't matter whether it was true or not. And Socrates pursued the truth. Now, some people may believe there is no truth or
yeah,
truth is relative,
yeah,
but I think still we can say there is a big difference between persuading. Just think about ads on
yeah,
TV that
yeah.
convince you that a certain product is good. That's not argumentation. They often don't give you reasons why their product is better.
Yeah.
They just want to convince you. So when I used to teach logic, we did a little bit of informal fallacies because that's where persuasion is so powerful.
Yep.
And I think it's dangerous.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I like your answer. It makes a lot of sense, actually, now that I think about it. But what do you think about this quote? I'm reading this book by Iris Murdoch, The Sovereignty of the Good, this British and Irish philosopher. It is sometimes said, either irritably or with a certain satisfaction, that philosophy makes no progress. It is certainly true, and I think this is an abiding and not a regrettable characteristic of the discipline, that philosophy has, in a sense, to keep trying to return to the beginning, a thing which it is not at all easy to do. There's a two-way movement in philosophy, a movement towards the building of elaborate theories, and a move back again towards the consideration of simple and obvious facts. McTaggart says that time is unreal. Moore replies that he has just had his breakfast. Both of these aspects of philosophy are necessary to it. What do you think about that?
I
Any
love that
opinions?
quote. I think it's so well, and I love Iris Murdoch. You should read her novels. You really would enjoy them. Um, I think the two examples she has at the end, McTaggart saying time doesn't exist, and Moore says, I just had breakfast, are cute as two examples of two different approaches. McTaggart is building the theory, big theory, complicated theory to show that time doesn't exist. And Moore, Moore
Yeah.
is relying on our experience. My experience is I had breakfast this morning, so
Right.
time exists. Now, I think in that quote, she's talking about two different tendencies in philosophy.
Yeah, right.
One is toward the construction of theories. The other is toward keeping close to experience.
Yeah.
And I put myself on that side. My work,
Yeah. All good.
my work has not been in building theories, but more in practicing
Yeah.
and in trying to understand our experience. For example, all my work on personal identity has been connected with trying to join the psychological experience with the bodily experience. Why? Because I think the body is very important to all of us. So I think she thinks it's a very rich quote. I can't do justice to all of that,
Yeah.
but in my teaching, I wanted to say I tried to do what she said, which is to go back to the simple. I read Plato in my class, and we look at his argument for educating men and women in the same way, because even Plato figured out that if you want to have citizens that can do everything, then you need to educate them in the same way. Think how simple that is,
Yeah.
and think how many countries don't follow that rule.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I also feel like I'm more of a common sense kind of person, but like, is there a word for that specifically? I guess you can call it intuitionism. That's the best I know of it. Is there like a word for like I don't know, like
I
dealing with a practical and instead of like these
right.
elaborate building of theories like physicists kind of, where I mean, it doesn't have to be it's not that it's not complicated or I don't know insightful or there's no breath to it, but you know it's there must be a word for it. Where I guess practical is the word. I'm more it's more practical instead of just ideas for the sake of ideas maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you know, because you read my interview, I think anti-realism is one way, or
Yeah.
anti-metaphysics, but when I describe myself as a naturalist. So, as a philosopher who believes that the world of science and experience is crucial to our knowledge, that what we know is grounded in experience. That's how I would describe my
Okay.
point of view. So
Yeah.
maybe that can help you.
Yeah. I think I would too. I think I'm a naturalist too, but
Good.
like I guess we can talk about your anti-realism stance. I'm not too read up on the different positions or anything, but you have a quote in your other interview that you're an anti-realist for math, right? But and
Yes.
maybe logic, and you have these anti-realism intuitions, maybe, or you know, inclinations. Could you expand on that? I guess. What do you mean
Yeah,
by
sure.
anti-realism?
Sure. So when I was working in philosophy or math, what I was just trying to do was to show that the notion of truth and necessary truth in mathematics didn't derive from the characteristics of the mathematical objects, but from the characteristics of our practice. The way we practice mathematics and the way we use logic is because of the way we think, because
Yeah.
of the type of being we are. So it formed, I think I was described as a conceptualist,
Okay.
meaning that concepts were so creation, human creation was what I thought mathematics was
Yeah.
about. Now, if you transfer that to other area, what that leads to is a sort of a denial that in metaphysics we need to make a lot of things real for them to be important. So I think in that interview, I talk about social constructs like race and gender and, those kind of concepts. Often there is the tendency for philosophers to say that in order for something to be really important, it has to be metaphysically grounded.
Yeah.
So, in order for mathematics to be true and necessary, there have to be objects that are abstract
Okay.
and that are the numbers. And in order for gender or race to be important, it has to be based on something real, like, chromosome or biology. And what I'm trying to do and say is that those things, gender and race for sure, and numbers as well, can be very important, even if they are not metaphysically grounded. And the same works for personal identity. It doesn't have to be the case that our psychology is metaphysically real for it to be important for
Yeah.
human beings. Of course, it's crucial. Of course, I identified with my thoughts, my desires, my plan, but that doesn't mean that thoughts, desires, and plans are abstract entities. They could be important even if they're not metaphysically grounded.
Yeah.
That's what my anti-realism is.
Yeah. I like your answer. I think I'll come back and re-listen to your
Sure.
answer. I like the framing of it, but I guess in response, somebody, I guess, I guess you can call them the realists, would say, isn't 2 plus 2 4 always, right? Like even outside of your psychology, they'll just say 2 plus 2 is 4, right? I guess you can call this an analytical truth. Is that a metaphysical truth? I don't know, but 2 plus 2 seems like it's 4 regardless of what anybody thinks. How would you respond? How
Right.
you know?
You're right. That's exactly what the realists would say. That Russell says something about the fact that in a universe in which there are no human beings, 2 plus 2 would still be equal to
Yeah.
4. It would still be a truth there. Now, that to me is to a certain extent incomprehensible
Okay.
because I think if you're already inputting the human concept of two and the human concept of plus and the human concept of two again and equal in order to say that is true no matter what. Well, you're pretending that the human being is not present there, but it seems to me that it's not so sure that those concepts would exist without the human beings having elaborated them, having a practice that is our arithmetic and mathematics that makes them meaningful. So I'm not sure what the realist is telling us. It's like, you see, the trick for the realist is to say there is a view. I think Thomas Nagel presented this, a view from nowhere. So they
Yeah.
imagine there is an entity, a God or an intelligence that can see this 2 plus 2 equals 4 in a world where there is no thought. And I don't buy that. I think they are a little bit cheating, putting
Yeah.
those concepts in there and then saying, but those are concepts that exist on their own without the human presence. Well, we don't know what the universe would be without the human vision. Maybe there wouldn't be any mathematics. Maybe there could be a different world in which there are different beings who actually think about numbers in a different way. So I don't buy it. But it's A very good objection.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I like that. But I guess you're pretty good at logic. Could you give me some logic tips? I guess I've got these ideas. So, like, why a three-step process for the typical premise conclusion argument? Is it to show how to deductively reason correctly? Like, I guess another way to say that is, what happens? Like, what if I just have like a long list of premises to reach a conclusion? That seems awfully bad because I think if you have a long list of premises, it's easier to defeat. And so you kind of want to keep it short and, and whatever it is. But what do you think about that?
Yes. When I used to teach logic and I would tell students to build an argument, they very often would do what you describe, which is to put a ton of premises and then derive the conclusion. And of course, that makes the argument extremely difficult to defend because for each and every premise, you have the possibility of a weakness or a counterexample. So it's much better to break down a reasoning in smaller units.
Yeah.
So what I used to teach was try to make, maybe a chain of modus ponens or modus tollens where you have two premises and a conclusion. And that is so much easier to discuss.
Yeah.
And then use the conclusion you prove as a new premise for another argument, but small argument. So that's the first comment I want to make. Two, when I taught my classes, I expected students to use small little arguments, but valid arguments. So either modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism. Why did I do that? Because it forces you to focus on just one statement at a time and try to figure out which one of your conviction make that statement true or false. If you have a ton of premises, it's really very hard to argue. There can be a lot more equivocation of terms, disagreement about what we mean. So, I'll give you an example. We would use stupid arguments, sometimes stupid, like, all murder is wrong. Euthanasia is murder. Therefore, euthanasia is wrong. Now, that argument is valid and it's difficult to discuss plenty. You ask the student, just started thinking about all murder is morally wrong. It seems like obvious, but it's not, right? First of all, what do we mean by murder? Okay, murder is the willful killing. So maybe the willful killing is morally wrong. But what in a war? What in self defense? That is still willful killing. You do want it, you're under duress. And so I tell my students that by looking at small little arguments, we can really think more in depth. And that's
Yeah.
where logic is useful.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's right. Probably shorter is better, and just to, as you said, simpler to defend and easier to understand. Another logic question is that if something is logically impossible, does that imply that it's a contradiction? So I say something like having an egg or eating it, right? You can either have an egg or eat it. If you have an egg, you can't eat it. If you eat the egg, you can't have it anymore, right? But if that's logic, meaning they're logically impossible for one to exist and the other to also exist. But is that also contradictory? Like, is it a contradiction to say that I ate it and I also have it or have the egg? I guess I'm kind of confused about that, but What do you
Right.
think?
I think it helps if you have a very clear definition of contradiction. So a
Yeah.
contradiction has to be a statement of the form P and not P.
Yeah.
Pieranna is Italian and Pieranna is not Italian. So it has to be exactly the same sentence, P,
Yeah.
one time affirmed, one time denied, and with a conjunction in between. That is a contradiction. Any other form of statement like, I have an egg and I ate an egg, it's not a contradiction.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the form is
Yeah. Yeah.
not the
Right.
form
Right.
of a contradiction. And because you can start thinking of a lot of situations. If you had two eggs to start from, you could have an egg and eat an egg.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
tells you in that statement that we are talking about the same egg? So that's why the form of the contradiction is very helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, when we started thinking about logic with Aristotle and other ancient philosophers, the reason why they condemned contradiction is because humans cannot think contradiction. I cannot think that P and not P. I cannot think that it is true that you are Yasuki and you are not Yasuki. I don't know how to conceptualize that.
Okay. Yeah.
And so they said a contradiction is something that we cannot hold as true.
Okay. Okay. What do you think about, like, I try to answer it in terms of a dependency relationship. I guess in terms of like having an egg kind of depends, like P depends on Q, like for one to exist depends on the other not existing, and the contradiction seems to be, I guess the contradiction seems to be, I don't remember now, something about dependency, like something about how, like free will and determinism. If determinism is true, free will is false, and they kind of depend on each other to be true or not true in a sense. What does depend mean? Like the truth of free will depends on determinism, maybe not being true, and then the truth of determinism depends on kind of, I don't know. Does that make sense? Like, not sure if I'm saying anything correct, right? But they kind of the propositions depend on each other in order for them to be true. The contradiction seems to be that, I don't know, the other must be false or something. I don't know. Is that even a contradiction? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, no, as I said, you need to be able to present a
Yeah.
statement that
Yeah.
contains an assertion and its denial in
Yeah.
order to have a contradiction. Now, the contrast between free will and determinism requires building an argument, and I used to once in a while use this, but not I haven't in a long time. But you would have to give a definition of
Yeah.
determinism such that every event is determined by previous causes. So the idea of determinism is that if you knew all the previous situation, all the previous causes, you will be able to forecast the next event. Now,
Yeah.
if that is true, then let's say in a deterministic world, what I will do after I talk with you, it's already determined. So whether I'll be finishing my book or having lunch is determined by all the previous state of affairs in the world. If that is the case, then it seems like I'm not free of doing something different. I'm not free of going out instead of eating or instead of reading the book. And so that's where the contrast comes. But in order to say that they are contradictory, you really need to be an argument.
Yeah, no, I get it. I think just go back to the definition of contradictions. And I probably don't know what I'm talking about with. Yeah, that's too complicated for me. Let's move to feminism. I take it you agree with Callahan's definition. A theory or political movement is feminist if and only if it begins with a realization that women and other underrepresented beings as a group have been or are still in a subordinate position in relation to men and other privileged groups. This also offers an account of the source of subordination, etc., etc. There's 4 definitions, but then you add like Crane's second definition, which is like the reading of the text and the questions that come from a text. And so, as an analytical feminist, you're doing that. I guess you think insubordination to men is wrong. Would you agree? And impartial understanding and moving forward with these questions, these feminist questions, is the right way to go. How would you contrast that to other feminists, I guess? Or what is an analytical feminist?
Okay. So you mentioned the definition of feminism as a political movement or as a theory that I used in all my writing. And I did derive it from John Callahan article. There are 4 conditions, and it's complicated, but you read too that women and other unrepresented or minority groups are subordinated to groups that have power. There is an explanation for why there is that subordination. And there is, in order to be feminist, you have to be committed to changing that. And you have to have some strategies. Those are the third and the fourth condition. So I like that definition. As I often say in class, one could say the third one is very important, right? Because one could say, sure, look around. People of color and women are paid less than white people and men. So that's an example of subordination. So it exists, I acknowledge. But then I have an explanation for it, somebody could say, because people of color and women are not as good at their job as white people or privileged people. Now, that's not feminist, right? It's not progressive at all. But it is somebody who satisfies the first 2 conditions: acknowledge a subordination and have an explanation for it, their explanation. So the third condition that says, I want to change this,
Okay.
is crucial to have a theory or a movement to be feminist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but doesn't he Callahan argue that they're independent of each other, and that was kind of tricky in a way. Like I guess he was trying to say that like you can just have one or two, but you don't need 3 or 4, and you're still a feminist.
I don't think she says that. She
She
said
sorry.
each of them is independently
Yes.
necessary,
Oh,
but
okay.
they are jointly sufficient.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay,
So that I wanted to say on that. And then you connected that very nicely with Tim Crane's definition of a philosophical tradition. And so I think I would say that, first of all, there are many feminisms. There isn't only one. So,
yeah.
but all these movements and theories that are feminists probably agree on number 1, number 2, and number 3, I think, of that definition. So there you could see joining the Tim Crane's definition and Callan's definition.
Okay, and how would you contrast this to like a historical, I guess, I don't know if that's a correct way, because I don't know if that's a correct way to define it, but there's a historical essence to feminism. But your approach seems to be maybe it's not totally non-historical, but it's analytical, right? It's a reading of the text and the questions related to it. But other
Yeah,
feminists are well, the first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, and then I don't know. I guess I wrote it. I mean, in your book, there's a quote that says, some feminist philosophers argue that insofar as as philosophy is feminist, it should advance feminist goals in a futile quest for knowledge or objective truth about fundamental reality is irrelevant. So I guess maybe there's a problem there. Is there a problem? What do you think?
oh, could you reread the quote for me? I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
missed it.
Yeah, sorry, page 104. Some feminist philosophers argue that insofar as philosophy is feminist, it should advance feminist goals, and the futile quest for knowledge or objective truth about fundamental reality is irrelevant.
Okay.
That was in a book, and
Yes,
so I guess
yes.
some people don't think. I guess some people think the historical account and this analytical impartial approach is not valued. It's not valuable. But I don't know
Okay.
because I don't know too much about feminism.
Right, right. Well, first of all, I would say that just because that definition, color definition, doesn't mention a history, it doesn't mean that it ignores history. And that for sure connects with the first condition. If you think about to be able to talk about subordination,
Oh,
you
I see.
have to
Yeah.
have a history behind it because the subordination came about for a history of facts. So I don't find the two to be in contrast. On the contrary, I think a history helps us to, for example, have an explanation. So the second condition, an account of the subordination, which is different from the one I gave you of the, let's say, sexist or anti-feminist who says, well, of course, women earn less because they are not as good, right? That explanation is not historical. That's an evaluative explanation. Okay, so first, definitely no contrast between the two. Um, what else should I tell you? Uh, uh, um, did you have a precise question? So
um.
I just want to say history has an important role
Yeah.
in feminist literature.
Yeah. That answers the question. I
Good.
guess. I guess I thought to be an analytical philosopher and to be an analytical feminist, you were value the history of it less, but it makes sense to say no, it's probably important, right? But it just wasn't too clear in the book, and I wasn't too sure.
Sure. Sure.
Um, so how do you? I guess the biggest not issue, but maybe you could explain. But what is feminist epistemology, or maybe even feminist metaphysics, or how does it relate? Because I believe it was stated that you can have a feminist epistemology or if there is a feminist metaphysics, but it
Yeah.
does seem, I guess in a way, it does seem not, I don't know I don't know the word. It doesn't seem not normal, like that's not typical at least. And I guess it does seem like you're trying to say metaphysics is typically supposed to be impartial, but then you have these values in it. And then same thing with epistemology, like science. It's supposed to be an impartial progression. I mean, understanding of pursuit of knowledge, but there's this feminist epistemology. And I suppose like answering like the feminists answer that by saying, my best explanation is that feminism is valuable to science. You can keep it objective. You cite Longino, Harding, this peer
Right.
review, and same thing with metaphysics, and also that science is not, or epistemology is not valueless anyways. Same thing with metaphysics. So feminism can be useful to metaphysics and epistemology. That was the best that I could understand. Is that correct?
Yes, I think you're correct. The starting point for those two fields is that the idea that the previous metaphysics or the previous epistemology that did not dialogue with feminism was not impartial, was not objective. It pretended to be because it was made by the same type of people. And when you have the same type of people thinking and creating theories, you're going to get theories that will look in a certain way, but may not be appealing or taking into account the intuition of people who are excluded from it. And this is something that was not said only by feminists. If you look to the strong program in philosophy of science, David Bloor, you will see he was a man, he was part of the normal academic environment, but he said that epistemology and philosophy of science were not impartial, that they were affected by social values. So, what feminists did was to focus on women. But the ideas were not just feminist, they were also of other critics of science. As for what women can produce, I want to give you again an example. Let's go back to when I was using Plato in my classes. I told you Plato, and now there are articles about whether Plato was a feminist or wasn't a feminist. I don't think he was a feminist, but he was clever because he figured out, as I said before, that if we want all citizens to do the same job, we need to educate all of them in the same way. So he talks about women, but interestingly enough, he has different groups of women he's thinking of. The women guardian he wants to educate like men. But then there are the slave women who he uses as prizes for the warrior. So when you're triumphing and you're winning, they give you gold, they give you houses and clothes and women. Now, the feminist literature was helpful in saying, wait a minute, which women are you talking about? Are you talking about the slaves? Are you talking about the guardians? And so bring to attention that the condition of women was not looked at very clearly. And, sometimes it's inevitable that a person who belongs to a certain group has more sensitivity to notice the problem that come out. It's not that they are privileged knowers.
Okay.
They just have their own experience that says, wait a minute, which women are you talking about?
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess it kind of connects to ethics because in the ethics portion, you cited Kohlberg and his, I guess, a study of a male approach view of
Correct.
justice. And you have a
Yes.
feminist or maybe female version, which is more centered towards care. Could you
Yes.
expand on that? So I guess it's like a feminist ethics or like a,
Yeah.
that's also true.
Yeah, that study, Carol Gilligan criticized Henry Kohlberg studies because he had made some experiment that proved that women's moral position was always inferior to the moral position of the male. And often the subjects were boys and girls. And boys reach the level of Henry Kyber list much more easily than girls did. So they used rules, and that was considered at that time as the highest level of moral development. So what Carol Gilligan was to say, wait a minute, this is not necessarily true. And she interviewed a lot of people and looked at the responses of these girls and showed how they were actually elaborate and complicated and articulate, and they weren't just following rules that can be sometimes much easier. The example he was using was whether a man should steal a drug from a pharmacist to save his wife's life. And the boys in the experiment would say stealing is always wrong, so the pharmacist cannot. And the girls would talk about trying to convince the pharmacist, explain to the pharmacist how important it was. And so they were judged as inferior because they didn't use the rule. But that didn't mean they weren't processing important moral reasoning.
Yeah.
So that debate that you talk about was very important for the beginning of feminist ethics.
Okay, great. So last question, last subject, okay? What is a woman? Let's talk about that. Right? Um,
Wow, there are a lot of debates. Go
you spoke of
ahead.
you spoke of a spectrum. I think you had the realist, the nominalist, and then the anti-realist. The ones who, I guess one is saying gender and men and women. The gender is totally real, whatever that implies, but real. And you move to like a label of it, I suppose, which has its use. Whether it's real or not can be debated. And then you move to like it's not real at all. It's what was it? Skepticism, pretty much, nominalism and realism. Could you explain the spectrum and what are you? I guess are you a realist or you do have anti-realist inclinations, but what do you think?
Right. Okay. First of all, I think it's important to keep separate sex from gender. Sex is meant to be the result of a classification that is based on biology, on three different criteria: the the chromosome that a person has, hormone that a person has, and also the genitalia, so the reproductive organs. Now, it turns out that those three criteria don't always align, and so you might have different combinations. Now, that has generated the spectrum of sex that you're alluding
Oh,
to.
okay,
And
makes sense.
the two articles that I strongly recommend are from Anne Foster Sterling. And she writes the first article in the news. It's entitled The Five Sexes. And the second one is The Five Sexes Revisited. So in biology, they tell us there aren't just two sexes. It's true, the majority of the people have those three criteria tally perfectly. But there are several people, and we should take them into account, for whom things are different. Now, in philosophy, I don't think we do philosophy with numbers. So we cannot just say, well, the majority are either male or female, so we don't care about the others. I think that's not a good answer. The good answer should be, let's analyze these terms and let's try to understand what we mean. This is in biology and in sex. With regard to gender, where we talk about feminine and masculine, not female and male, feminine and masculine. there, it turns out it's complicated too, because now we have people who are fluid, they call themselves genderqueer, we have trans. So the issue is the binary, just thinking that it's possible to be all male, all female, all feminine, or masculine. Sometimes people are a mixture of those. So, what's my position? That we shouldn't try to make this distinction metaphysics. In the sex area, we should trust biology because they study this stuff. And what they tell us should be taken seriously. With regard to gender, we should look at social sciences, philosophy, feminist literature, history, and try to figure out what do we mean by man and woman. It's not very easy to define them.
Yeah, some people will just say that men and women, I mean, the gender just relates to the sex, and they're just
Correct.
and that
Correct.
is as far as it goes, right? Like these two things, they overlap with sex, and that's it.
Right.
And that
Right.
speaking more of it is, they will say, speaking beyond, going beyond two is pretty much insane or insanity. But I don't know,
Right.
right?
Right. But then why do we have different terms? Why do we talk of gender if we mean sex? I don't believe gender is identical to sex. I think gender means a lot of other things to people. It means pink and blue. It means trucks and dolls. It means a lot of things where we indoctrinate people to play certain roles. And I think we need to think seriously about it because there is nothing determined there. The biology doesn't determine that you need to play with trucks and I need to play with dolls. It's
Yeah.
it's not true.
Okay.
So
Yeah. I guess last question. I do like Asta's conferalist view, where she says an individual acquires the property of a woman when those around her view or treat her in a particular way. I like it in the sense that it explains this transgender debate where one person says a male says I'm a woman, and the
yes,
world says no, you're not, you're a man. And that kind of explains what's going on, where it's like a defeating, like a pushing on labels towards individuals who wish to be the opposite sex.
yes.
What do you think?
I think you're right, and I think the whole debate and the whole and that's why I wanted to say I am an anti-realist. There is nothing metaphysical or real about this. It's a political decision how we want to treat people who say, I was born with all or some male characteristic, biological characteristic, but I believe I am a woman, or some people say, I believe I'm female. Some people say I am a woman. So they don't necessarily mean some people are transsex. They want to change their sex. But some people are transgender, don't want to change their sex. They want to change their gender. So there, we need to try to figure out what that means. Because if you are a person who is heterosexual, who has no intersex differences, it may be very hard for you to understand a person who says something like, I just said. And
Yeah.
so it seems to me, as usual, that it is a social and political choice to listen to these people and try to figure out how to treat them. Just like you said, how do we want to treat this? We can't just say, no, You were born in this way, and no matter what you say, that's what you are. I think that's making a big choice for them, and I'm not sure it's legitimate.
Okay. Yeah, great answers, Professor. I had a
Okay.
wonderful time. That was the last of my questions. I will end the recording right now.